So I'm really, really delighted to be joined by Tim Casson, Sindi Breshani, and Luke Pearson. I will do a very, very brief intro. I have pictures and a video, but I think that during the conversation it'd be wonderful to kind of get a deeper understanding of what you're doing through us actually chatting. As you've already met Tim, who is the director of the Game Arcade and Casson and Friends, and works within kind of playful movement to make these games that have a wonderful kind of connection to folk games, which you might have seen at the festival this year. This was one of the reasons we wanted to kind of bring this in as a nice connection from one to the other. I'll do everyone, and then I can do this. And folk games. More on that soon. And Sindi Breshani, thank you so much for joining us again. If you came to the Summer Summit last year, you might recognize Sindi from a panel where we were talking about Sindi's narrative work and being the director of Episode Studio. More on that also. And finally, Luke Pearson, who is one half of UNP, a groundbreaking game and architecture organization who you may have seen the book Video Game Architectures. Video Game Architectures, yes, that is right. That's the title of the book.
Video Game Atlas.
Video Game Atlas, and is running the Video Game Architectures course within UCL. If you don't mind, I'd like you to, because I kind of stumbled through that, if you would say a little bit about your work each as we kind of go along, and yes, what you're doing within games. And I think I'm starting with Sindi in the middle there. So I have a few pictures.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I don't think I will ever stop saying that Now Play This is my favorite festival in the games industry. And I actually started making games after visiting Now Play This, when I saw that games are inherently a medium of storytelling and a piece of technology. So I was interested more in the notions of play and what stories can we tell, and started Episode Studio as an indie game studio where we create games about true stories. And we integrate stories of people that are closer to the stories that we tell. For example, we're working now on Race for the Arctic, which is a game about climate change in the Arctic. And you come into the game as everything has changed since last year. So if you've seen me then, forget it. You come into the story as the diplomat. She traveled across the Arctic to look at what is happening, what is predicted to happen. Ice is melting, new opportunities are coming. But she meets 8 unique people there, and they change her. Everybody is leading a unique race to save the Arctic. And she learns that everybody's individual work matters, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem. And we get her book about all the people that she met, and we are transported into their stories. And so we're working with real communities in the Arctic and looking at how we can integrate these true testimonies into games that are fun to play and not just documentaries that we can watch.
The video. I think, shall we do it without sound and you tell us about yourself? I'm saying that we have a choice. Sound doesn't work.
That's fine. I can talk over it. It's all good. So I make performance in lots of different ways. I'll let this happen. So Arcade is our current touring production, and it is for outdoor spaces, public spaces, and festivals. And I've always played a lot of games in my work as a way of getting people moving. And so we chose the best games that we had. And in the show, you'll see we have a team of 7 performers who are facilitating and performing and playing the games beautifully. Some games are beautiful to watch, and others are easy and also beautiful to join in with. You can see a small person moving some shoes and a line being formed. We were just playing that game outside. I was really interested in how playing in public spaces can change the nature of what that public space is or feels like or looks like, and also the question of who can play, and trying to get older people and big people, not just little people playing. So there's a sort of political thing there for me, gently. But I think I've always made work that is participatory. I was saying outside that I described the work that I make as people-powered performance. So, for example, if you think to what we were doing outside, that then becomes a performance because there's a group of people doing it, and we are, whether you like it or not, you were sort of the performers gently coerced into that. And I think, yes, I could be playing those games on my own, but it wouldn't be so much fun. So there's something around sharing that joy and bringing joy to people where they are, but also that becoming something that's nice to watch as well and feels performative. And that's arcade, but I do lots of other work as well. But yeah, that's the main reason I'm here, and thanks.
And then finally, a couple of pieces from you and Lee. If you don't mind telling us a little bit about the practice and how we've got here.
Yeah, so thanks for the invitation, Nick. And we were lucky enough to do a piece, Sandra and I. So I'm one half of UMP, which is a design studio working between architecture and games, which I run with Sandra Ukana. And we were lucky enough to do a piece in 2018 for Now Play This, which I think was a really great sort of commission for us to be able to explore some of these ideas of the relationship between the cities we live in, the spaces that we design, and how video games and games might have a kind of role to play in that.
I should have put P-Pop City up there, I realised.
It's slightly smaller scale, so it's harder to sort of see that in the kind of architectural sense. But maybe the biggest project that we've worked on recently has been our book, Video Game Atlas, Mapping Interactive Worlds, which came out at the end of 2022, where we kind of look at 12 commercial video games through the lens of architectural history and theory to think about how there might be very deep connections to things that we've explored and been interested in the past in relation to our society and culture and the places we live and video games. And I think we've kind of chosen this route between the two disciplines because we both trained as architects, but we're really interested by the fact that for millions and millions of people, video games are kind of synthetic spaces that they interact with every single day that suggest different possible futures, different types of societies and things like that. So we see games as a very powerful medium for architects to kind of learn from and to integrate into their design works. So that's kind of what we've decided to do ourselves, and we'll see how it's going.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Actually, that will no, don't no claps yet. They haven't earned it yet. We will go kind of deeper into exactly that, I think, in the questions we have. So that felt really aggressive. I take that back immediately. I apologize. I love you all. So I want to ask a few questions to our panelists. I've got kind of 3 slightly chunkier questions, one for each of you, and then a few general questions to kind of all of us together so we can kind of have a chat a bit more openly. And I invite you to have this chat with us. Like, I think that the main thing about the design lab is that we really are participant-led. This doesn't have to be just a kind of Q&A. We say a bunch of stuff and then you ask your questions at the end. If anything comes up that you have comments that we're talking about, please do chime in. I can come around as a roving mic. Hello. We will get there. I promise you we'll get there. We'll weave it in. For anyone who's watching this as a recording in the future, that was a question about folk games. So yes, we'll have a few questions here, opportunities to chat all together, but if you do have some questions that you would like to kind of pose at a particular point, I will invite you then as well, so that don't feel, if you feel uncomfortable kind of chiming in beforehand, don't worry about that. We'll have that moment as well. I'd like to start with you, Tim, if that's all right. So something that we, as a group, started gently exploring yesterday through our workshops and kind of general prototyping was the idea of play giving a sense of ownership. And I think that that's something that we explored again outside, this idea of being able to kind of own a space a bit more, have a bit more agency within a space by playing within it. And I wanted to know a bit more about your thinking behind blending kind of choreographic movement as opposed to kind of free movement and just play into the work you're doing, and how you think that sits against that idea of players having agency or ownership within a space. I said they'd be chunky.
Yeah, this is chunky. So I suppose Yeah, there's something around like public spaces. Firstly, I'm really interested in because a lot of public spaces aren't actually truly public; they're public-private. So, and I learned that quite quickly trying to like produce and put on the first shows that we did. I started with a show I mentioned maybe earlier called The Dance We Made in 2012. In 2012, we went to 20 different spaces across London, and it was me and a filmmaker friend, and I would be asking people for dance moves and putting on these small performances based on all these movements that I'd been given in 20 spaces, and we had to figure out they had to be iconic because they had to sort of look good on film. It was the Olympics, there was a lot going on, but I had to also figure out who owned them, and it might be a shopping centre, or it might be kind of St Paul's Cathedral, or it might be, so that was quite tricky to sort of negotiate that. So there's something around, do we own those spaces anyway, and what like politically does that look like? But I think there's something around playing games in those spaces that can hopefully create a bit of more of a sense of ownership, and particularly connection. I think with a lot of public spaces, you might get people from different demographics going to that place, and we try and create situations where anybody who is there can participate evenly and in a way that is equal, and there's equity and equality within that, whether you're young or older, or and I think our ambition is to try and change the makeup of the performing casts in the performances that we make. So we have an ambition for Arcades that we will have, out of our 6 or 7 performers, 1 performer from every decade of life, so that someone walking past would see someone who is maybe 60 or 70 playing these games, and they wouldn't have an excuse to say no, because if they're doing it, then we can, or someone a lot younger. So there's something around that, and just the ownership of our bodies, I suppose. In terms of, you mentioned about like choreographic work and like set movement, I suppose, being owned by someone else versus free movement. I suppose playing games often is free movement. A lot of the choreographic movement that we generate as a company, I will work with dancers to generate stuff through tasks, so it's quite playful in itself. We kind of feel like we're playing a lot of games. As an example, a show we just made was all about gardening, and someone who we met through the process of making it, just as an aside, said, you should probably make a dance about compost. That would be really cool. And so we went into the studio and we were like, how do we make a dance about compost? How does this even work? And so we just sort of played with lots of ideas, and it's the performers themselves who generated that movement, but I would go in and I'd tweak and turn screws and go, that thing looks really good, let's do that. So then there's a bit of a weird ownership thing, because my job becomes more of a curator and a director than it does the movement is not coming from my body. I had a long career as a dancer, and people employed me because they liked how I moved, but I'm not interested in other people moving like me. I'd rather they move like them, and that's the performers that I work with. But then we've also had this request from a member of the public that we met to make a dance about compost. So like, who does it belong to? Because someone else's, like my concept, someone else's idea, and someone else's movement they're generating from their bodies. So it's, there's a blurry ownership thing, which I suppose is why my company is called Casson and Friends, because I'm Tim Casson, and it feels like it's everybody, not just one person. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's you bring up a couple of really interesting kind of kernels within that as well, that there's something about advocacy within your performance and within your dance. I say you, I mean everyone, within everybody, when you're moving, when you're playing, you are also an advocate for play, in a way. And then the other one off kind of being able to kind of illustrate and have that agency of these things while you're doing them, like if it's, regardless of whether it's choreographic or more free, having the invitation to do it, as you showed us outside with the example of someone being on the floor, meeting someone else could be on the floor. Suddenly, everyone gets that invitation to own that space for a moment. Yeah, fantastic.
Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, before I jump onto another question, like, do you want to kind of say anything about that one, or should we move swiftly on? I'll keep going. I'd like to jump to you, Luke, if that's all right. So I'd like to kind of draw on your methodology as a whole. That sounds really grand as a way to start a question, but I was thinking about the work you're doing with your course and the way that that's illustrated through the book as well. I was thinking about kind of other long-standing practices within kind of digital and virtual media for architecture, so things like speculative architecture, considering how spaces are operated within, and even like forensic architecture, using intricate digital processes to uncover kind of hidden truths. What are your aims with the research and utilization of video game architecture, and how do you see it sitting within the kind of architectural pantheon, as it were?
That's quite a big question. I think on some level, as you say, there is, so with studios like Forensic Architecture who are doing really important work, there's this sense that bringing tools like game engines into your practice suddenly unlocks, as you've kind of been talking about, it unlocks user agency in the process. And I think, so Sandra and I have been teaching a studio for about 8 years at the Bartlett, which was called, at UCL, which was called Video Game Urbanism, and it's now become this new course called Cinematic and Video Game Architecture. And I think maybe by way of example, one of the first projects, student projects that we had was looking at the way that planning is communicated in the UK. So, you know, you want to build a new building, you get approval, you then put up all these kind of little signs on signposts that say there's going to be this built here. And it doesn't really give you, as a member of the public, that much information about like what is actually happening, who's paying for it, what is this thing going to be. It might just say like 3-story building, class like A, whatever. And so these students started making a game where it's like, what could you make that fulfills that kind of semantic criteria? Like, how bizarre could that be? What could be all the possibilities of that? And I think this idea of integrating kind of user feedback, but in a playful way into some of these design processes, but also to use games as a tool because they have immediacy and you have a large audience that knows how to kind of engage with these things. You start to unlock conversations that maybe in something like architecture, which is kind of legally protected and has quite a lot of stratification in it as an industry, you can sort of erode those boundaries a little bit. But maybe to kind of turn that round a bit as well, what we've also always encouraged students, and we've done ourselves in our work, is to, I think, encapsulate that kind of speculative spirit, to sort of look at the future of what cities and buildings and the places that we live, the places that we work, the places that we play, what they could be through these media, because it also allows us to experiment with the agency that we offer players and kind of how we let them live in this world as well as imagine those worlds. And I think maybe, as we discuss quite a lot in the book, we go back into the history of architecture to think of when architects used to do that in the past. So like in the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of really radical architects that were imagining what the future of the world would be like. Is it going to be like giant grids flying everywhere over the whole world because the world would kind of becomes sort of subservient to capital? Or is it going to be a world where we kind of play and we wander around and we build, rather than being given a house, we build whatever we want, wherever we want it? And of course, all of those ideas didn't necessarily come to pass, but it was thinking about how the way that we organise space is kind of intrinsic to what the future of our society might be, which I think obviously touches on that kind of question of what is public space nowadays. So I would say, to maybe try and answer that more simply, We see ourselves as kind of like speculative architectural thinkers, but we think that games are a really powerful medium to kind of progress that. In the past, architects might have made drawings, they might have made films, but now through games we can also invite people into those speculations and kind of test them and iterate them, and we find that to be very powerful for our work.
Amazing, fantastic answer. I'm sitting here just like, yeah, and realise I now have to ask more questions. Just as a brief note within that, if any of what Luke is saying sounds interesting, we had an event a couple of days ago with a kind of virtual architecture organisation over in Canada who recreated the fun palace idea. So this is touching on the architectural idea from the 1960s of fun palaces. As these kind of community cultural spaces that anyone can kind of come into and make whatever they want within. And yeah, we had this amazing event where this group of makers and researchers created a fun palace within Minecraft over 60 days in a kind of survival server. And it's a really, really lovely thing to see. So that's online as well, just in case you want to kind of dive deeper into this idea of kind of speculative architecture from, 60s onwards. You mentioned about the use of kind of video game practices or video game mechanics as a way of enlightening some of those kind of more oblique things, like having a sign on the side of a wall saying, like, this is the planning permissions that are going in. This might be some of my own biases in seeing some of these things, but I immediately in the back of my head go, oh yeah, that sign is by design, like it's supposed to be quite oblique. And so by contrast, it feels like what you're saying, there's something quite utopian and quite democratizing about what you can do with these game spaces and with a kind of interactive digital recreation of something. Maybe let's come back to that as well. I'd like to jump to you, Sindi, if that's all right. Thank you again for coming back. Like, it's always a wonder, it's a joy speaking with you. So it's one of the kind of lovely things about having you here again is that we can delve into how your games have changed over the years and how the kind of narrative shifts are being used for your players and kind of what it is you're really trying to hone in on. Also using the different lenses of the themes we're looking at. So last year, it was around kind of care systems, and this year we're kind of looking at it from a more kind of liminal lens. And so I want to talk about the kind of narrative within, I think, Race for the Arctic and Dictatura specifically. I think last year we talked a lot more about propaganda as it kind of fit with the theme. These are three of Sindi Breshani and Episode Studios games, which you can see online on their website. So narrative games work to bring quite distant and often quite abstract kind of sites and situations to the player. How do you consider your position as the storyteller within these narratives? Like, how are you balancing bringing the reality of that world and telling an engaging story? Like, what are the, what's the process behind that, and what do you find to be the key parts of that process?
I'm trying to think, how do I answer this without giving like a lecture and the history of the company? But we were talking earlier on how we have a similar reference point, which is Paulo Freire and Augusto Boll, who talk about critical consciousness and theater of the oppressed, which is the idea that in our current education system and how we see storytelling, we are passive. And through games, it's the only medium of storytelling that we are participants and we are understanding and exploring the story. And this in turn can help us see the world differently and be more empowered to look through all the pieces of information that we get into the world. So for me, this was the first starting point. As a designer, coming from an ex-totalitarian country, I'm from Albania, which used to be a dictatorship, I always had an interest of I always wondered, how could my parents believe what they were saying during the dictatorship? How could you believe that eating fish with cheese is poisonous? Or all the stuff, like Italy is coming to invade us and stuff like that. And my parents told me that we knew no other alternative. This was the only truth. So knowing that through games we can change how we see reality, and the power of having different perspectives can actually help us look at the world differently. I feel like I was sitting in between, like a designer. So how we build games is something like that. In our principles, we have that we always have to tell different perspectives in our games. When we talk about climate change, when we talk about dictatorships or propaganda or any future title that we want to produce, we need to bring different multi-layered perspectives. So in Race for the Arctic, we have 8 different people from 8 different places around the Arctic Circle. Scientists, indigenous communities. We also have researchers that are looking at how new shipping routes are going to bring new economic opportunities. The second layer is that we always have a player-centric storytelling. So at the center of every story, we want the player to be a participant. So they come as the diplomat reading her book and they take her role. In Dictatura, they are a secretary of the party, that they're creating files of all the people living in this dictatorship. And for us, the third one, which kind of ties into the first 2 questions, we always want to build real places, real situations. So it's the Arctic, it's the Albanian dictatorship, because we always feel like the real world already has all these amazing stories and very powerful stories that we can learn from. So why try to fictionalize something that has already happened and we can learn from it? So it's kind of through these 3 points that we try to create our games, and that's why our games have changed. In the beginning, we started as something very artistic with Race for the Arctic, and I really like in game design that games kind of tell you themselves what they want to be. It just doesn't work. You test it and it just doesn't work and you have to change it. And now I feel like we have a character that really ties the story and the themes that we want to get across with the game. So I don't know if it answered the question.
I think it does. I think it is both an answer to the question, also a very nice intro to the next workshop that we'll have later on.
Yeah.
I think what I found very interesting in that was that you mentioned Race for the Arctic starting out very artistic, and how that might be something you're moving away from. And I kind of think about this idea of telling real stories versus artifice, and maybe that's kind of what a lot of game design or a lot of art and creation is, like working out where the line of reality and lived experiences is, and how you frame, and maybe artifice is the framing. But I think that maybe that's quite implicit for a lot of makers, and it's really interesting, and I think something that we could all learn from, to think about using that kind of art or artifice as a mechanic for telling those real stories, as opposed to just the thing that we just do already. Thank you. I'm going to kind of open it up to just some kind of broader questions, because I feel like that we've nailed into some like real kind of hard truths about what we do, and maybe I would really like to hear kind of how we all kind of connect on all of these things together. I think I'd like to go straight into this idea of folk games. I think. So we, as a very brief intro, we had a workshop with a wonderful maker called Emily Kuntz at Now Play this year, who led some kind of group-based folk games for our audiences, and brought just some kind of classic ones, because she works as a researcher specifically within kind of folk games and how we retell these kind of physical games. Taking a step kind of backwards, folk games are things like Tag or It can be a folk game, because we all kind of know it. Everyone has a different version. Like, there are house rules. Folk games are the kind of things you tell your friends. They can be games you play in bars. It could be the idea of, like, I think even like 52 card pickup counts as a folk game. 52 card pickup is throwing a deck of cards on the floor and then picking it up again. And that's it. Like. Maybe that's a bad example, because you play it on others. You throw it down and then someone else has to do it.
It's like a trick. You just assume, if they don't know what it means, hey, do you want to play your 52 card pickup? There you go. And they go, oh, okay.
But yeah, exactly. But the kind of underlying part of that is that it's the kind of thing that we all heard in a playground somewhere, as opposed to Nintendo giving it to us, or that's a very extreme opposite. But the folk games are these things that we play primarily physically. They tend to happen in real space, which is why often they get called kind of street games as well. But yeah, they kind of happen with other people, like they happen kind of together. Where am I coming into this? Oh, yeah, so I wanted to talk about the idea of games, play, and then being playful. I think that those are the kind of three kind of tent poles of the things that you're all doing, and I think that you sit within them at kind of different kind of levels. As a kind of opener for the audience, I see that being kind of games, being 52 card pickup is a game. It has rules. Play is potentially some of the things we did outside, where the rules will shift. When we were playing Snake, we decided we wanted to follow another snake instead of just going in a line, that kind of thing. And then being playful could be just running or kicking a ball around, like not using any rules within it, but using the acts and ideas of play to like have fun. And I think within all of the work you're doing, there are different avenues that you're taking into those three. I think without kind of putting kind of words into your mouths already. I feel like, Tim, you come at it from the space of play, of being playful, and then using that to make play and then make games. And perhaps with Luke, it's from the other side of looking at games and then using those the other way to inspire people to be playful or play. How do you feel about these as categories for a start? Are they useful? Is this something that we as makers or participants even over the next 2 days can use or utilize? And how do you see them kind of fitting within your practice? Is it a kind of useful mechanic for you personally? I'll hand that to you so you can all get it involved.
Maybe I'll start on riding the folk game wave, because actually I hadn't really heard that term until relatively recently, but it absolutely makes sense. And I think in the making of Arcade, I just wrote down all the games I've ever played, and a lot of the time I will technically within dance, it's a structured improvisation, which is like the least sexy way of describing a thing. But I always felt like they were games and they could be really playful, and it just happened to be like what attitude you take with it. But recently we made Arcade last year, and I did a bit more redevelopment this year and added some more games in. So I was in Emily's session, which was really, really brilliant. And I've stolen one game from Emily, if you're watching, hello. We didn't play it today. It's a little bit like Four Corners, if anyone's played a game called Four Corners, but it's only 2 corners, so we call it 50-50. And that, anyway, we'll go into that later. But what was I going to say? I started looking at game books. I bought loads of books of games online, and that was really fascinating to sort of then look at them and then start to remix them. So I saw a version of Tag called Everyone's It, where everyone's it. So and it is chaos and the most exhausting game you'll ever play. But that's now part of our show, because I thought that was really fantastic. There was an interesting kind of thing about a lot of games. Like, there were books of specifically non-competitive games, but they were released by Christian book publishers. So there was something about like, what does that mean if we make something non-competitive? Is it still fun? Is it still a game? Is it playful? I thought that was a fun, interesting thing that came up. But I feel like for me, games have rules. So I was looking at things with rules, and what are those rules? Play is vital, and playfulness is about the act of playing and trying to figure out how do you provide a situation within which people can play and be playful, particularly in spaces they wouldn't usually, or for people who also wouldn't usually themselves. I don't know if that...
Yeah, absolutely. What about you as well?
How I see them and how I try to kind of introduce them at the episode. Playful for us is a state of being. Play is a method, and game is a medium. So playful, and the UN actually declared the 11th of June the International Day of Play, and play has been accepted as a right for us. So children are allowed to play, and dealing with governments now and how to change all of that. And we've seen it. So before doing propaganda, which was our first game, I was doing workshops on how to be a propagandist and what does that mean. And I saw that people from different perspectives, I was working with people, one from Serbia, one from Kosovo. For the first time, they could talk about memories of the war without being from Kosovo and Serbia in this playful, interactive workshop. So it's a state of kind of being allowed to live what you know and what you accept in your real world or reality, and then stepping into another framework and looking at things differently. And then play, it's a method that we kind of use in different projects. We've done, for example, a digital exhibition that we said, why should we design it as 4 walls and we put stuff around? We made it an origami paper house that you interact and open up. And that's how we made a kind of a play. We used play to create something digitally. And then games are ultimately kind of like our products and the medium that we want to build something more large scale for players worldwide, and something that we can distribute to everyone.
I think for us, architecture can be quite a sober discipline. So the playfulness is also our kind of way of asking questions through like destabilizing what you might think to be the kind of given situation that you find yourself in. I mean, like there's a kind of maybe not so much now, but like 10, 15 years ago, the long shadow of games and architectures like SimCity. SimCity is the ultimate kind of model, and obviously City Skylines comes along. And what we looked at in our book that was really interesting is that City Skylines, the basic game would like let you build an American city. It wouldn't let you build a city in another part of the world under different logics. So people, coming back to the kind of folk, not quite the same thing, but what we became really interested in is sort of folksonomies, the knowledge that the player base creates around the game and how they extend it. So in something like City Skylines, loads of people have modified it. They've kind of changed the rules, or they've made guidelines for how people can subvert things. It's like you couldn't build a sort of a street of terraced houses like you'd find in London in the game unless you kind of trick the game into the way that it populates the buildings. So you get this kind of body of sort of folk knowledge where people are saying, I want to make a city with terraced houses, therefore I need to like tile things in this specific way because someone's found that out and kind of communicated that through the community. But I guess what we also really like the playfulness of kind of the layers that games have as well between the world that's kind of represented and the rules that kind of govern it and the agency that's given to the players. So obviously as architects we thought we have to make a city builder game, but we made a game called the London Developers Toolkit, which is a kind of response to the proliferation of like luxury high-rise residential towers in London, which since I moved here has like kind of gone crazy. And so in the game you play as an architect working for a property developer, and you have to do all this stuff that architects do, like do an amazing sketch on a napkin to show your kind of inspirational thing. Then you have to like input all these parameters about how luxurious, how extravagant you want the building to be. And then at the end you have to do this kind of stupid memory game of like which borough of London would have approved this horrible tower. And you get to the end and you have this kind of like crap Photoshop where you can make a sort of advert for your building and you can print it, and you used to be able to send it to a Twitter bot. But the deeper layer to that was that you do not control the building that's generated whatsoever. It's completely random, and it's a load of like pieces that we've kind of sourced and designed ourselves that might relate to like, the top of the building might be a giant statue of Margaret Thatcher, or it might be like a nightclub curated by the guy Flavio Briatore, or it might be an air purification system or something, these kind of bizarre things that you can find from the sort of lives of the super rich. And so the point of that game was that you feel like you're having agency as a designer, but you're following capital, you're following the money. And so you have agency, but you don't have agency at the same time. And as a designer working in like the architecture industry, which like many other industries is guided by investment and capital, it can sometimes feel like that. So we think that games as a structure and playfulness is a really nice way to like peel apart those things and kind of see what happens as a result.
Oh, you're good.
I was just going to say, it feels like there's something about like parameters and the parameters that we work within, and being consciously playful within that, whether or not it's like the parameters and the expectations of public space, and trying to do that and make that a bit blurry, or like the parameters of planning permissions and how do you play within that, and also like you mentioned about kind of having an exhibition, but it's not going to be square. It's going to be, so if you can sometimes either do you work within that, or do you like shift what those parameters are, and is that the playfulness, changing the contents or the container almost?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, no, I think exactly on Tim's comment. I think that what's coming up quite a lot here is the ideas of, or the competing ideas of agency and reality. Maybe that's a bit grand or a bit lofty, a bit sweepy, but it feels like there's something within that of being able to use games as a place to create an entirely new world, whether that's entirely invisible and just inside your own head while you're playing a game, or fully constructed down to a kind of building or an art space, or something that you can kind of see and kind of perceive the walls that have been created within it, and then using that as a way of questioning what it would look like in the real world, kind of how these spaces kind of exist. I want to have one more question from myself, kind of slightly broader one, and then I'd like to open it up to the floor if anyone has questions for our wonderful panelists. I was kind of thinking about how to kind of broach something to all of you, and realize we have this wonderful kind of conglomeration here today of kind of people from kind of games culture, games industry, games research. Kind of you're all kind of hitting these wonderful kind of spaces that I think a lot of us are thinking at the moment of where those are all sitting within kind of games, what the state of games is, like kind of how we can all kind of exist within these places when kind of the traditional kind of game pipeline is eroding. So I'd quite like to get your takes on the kind of state of games at the moment, like how you see games and play being used or adopted where they might not have been before. There have been thoughts about whether this is a bad time to kind of get into games, and I think that it's a lot more complicated than that, of course. But I'd like to kind of get your views on where you sit within the kind of wider kind of culture of arts and your kind of practice with games. It's a lot to digest.
I can maybe start. Maybe it's quicker. So how we see ourselves is somewhere at the intersection of we see the games industry that is now, for the first time, with I'm sure everybody has seen the big wholesome, direct, and cozy game movement. That for the first time we can see how games are evolving from mechanics-based to more like a feeling, emotion-based. And we're wondering if this is happening, what are the other categories that are coming? And we're thinking, could we have an IMPA games category or true stories category at some point? And we see this in the gaming industry. And coming into this, we can see the film industry is coming with all the interactive films. Then we have education coming into there. And through that lens, we can see culture, museums, and if possible for us to be somewhere there where we're going to make these games that are accessible to players worldwide, to take them to the Arctic, to the Albanian dictatorship, to the ex-Yugoslav wars, and then to be able to work with museums and designers and creatives to make more and more, and to be the place that players and developers meet.
I'm going to sort of stay in my lane, I guess, in terms of, like, I really like that games are sort of becoming more physical. I have an Oculus Quest 2, and I absolutely love it. And I love games like Super Hot or Fisherman's Tale that just allow you to play in such a beautiful way, or even the Climb, like climbing simulators. And they're things that are making you use your body rather than your thumbs or your fingers, which is absolutely fine. So I think there's something really interesting there in terms of like how the technology is sort of shifting, how we're interacting with it. And I'm absolutely not bashing technology. I love technology, and I've done quite a lot of collaboration in the past, particularly with Amazon Alexa. So we started developing a few years ago an Alexa game where you would be able to say, Alexa, let's make a dance, and Alexa would guide you through making something together in your kitchen. And the idea of that being in your home, so it's kind of safe, but also it being an audio-based thing rather than a YouTube tutorial of seeing a professional doing it really well and maybe you feeling insecure if it's only audio guided. Then, so I think for us, we've been kind of interested in, what's the potential within dance, but also in public space work and outdoor work, just reminding people the importance of play. And the example that I gave earlier of walking past the children's playgrounds at break time and seeing small people just running around making noise, and how do we harness that as a really vital thing as an adult that we just forget how to do. Maybe less of the screaming as an adult, but yeah. All the screaming.
Yeah, I think for architecture maybe specifically, technology has been a bit of a gateway, because now architects are seeing value in game engines, because real-time rendering can now be very high quality. It means you don't need to pay people to do very expensive visualizations. And for students in particular, they're absolutely loving the fact that they can make a building, put it into Unreal Engine, and it will look extremely realistic very quickly and kind of give them feedback as designers. And I think, so while I think there's obviously much bigger question, I think the point about the broadening of what games are and game genres and things like that is really exciting. For other industries, I think the technology is like a sort of a gateway into things, because suddenly you see that this software has a lot of value for you. But the thing that we've always wanted to say is that using that software just to make a visualization of a building that you walk around, that you just give to a client, is perhaps not the most interesting way in which that might be applied. So then I think it leads you on to actually questioning these ideas of agency, so asking students to kind of go beyond that and think what capacity does someone have to kind of engage with to affect your world, which then becomes quite powerful because it opens up a new set of questions. And I think what that will also do is, by connecting different types of designers into sort of making them games adjacent, which I know, like, I worked on a thing with the Serpentine galleries as well, and they've done a lot of work about artists who are like games adjacent in their practices, and that field's obviously expanded a lot. I think it means that there starts to become a lot more practices that challenge maybe the sort of some of the implicit structures of like what a commercial game should be, what genres are, and things like that. Personally, Sandra and I, most of our works have been commissioned by like game festivals or museums or things like that, so we've never really made a sort of commercial game and had to fit into that kind of template. But it definitely feels the more sort of different design disciplines that start to use game technologies and kind of game design thinking, the more challenges it poses for game design, like in a really productive way, I think. So I think that's really exciting, and that's kind of also where we've tried to situate our studio.
Great. I'd like to kind of open it. Thank you. I'd like to kind of open it to the floor for questions. I'll be a kind of roving mic. We're also recording it, so I want to make sure that people at home can.
It's just a clarifying question. Hi. Thank you, everyone. This is so formal now. Blah, 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 blah. I can't remember anything. I got nervous now. Give me a moment. I just can't remember your name. Tim. My question is for you, Tim. You said these two games as if everyone would know them, but folk games are very culturally specific. So what were the two games that you mentioned? Super Hot and...
Okay. These are both VR games, Super Hot and A Fisherman's Tale.
Okay.
So just like one sentence on each. They're really big. They're totally YouTubeable. Super Hot is a game which uses kind of the bullet time mechanic that you would have seen in The Matrix if you're as old as I am. But like villains, avatars will shoot bullets at you, and essentially the bullet will move through space at the speed that you are moving in space. So your mission is to not get shot and to dodge any flying objects. But if you move very quickly, the objects will move quickly, so you end up doing these crazy things. So that's Super Hot. And Fisherman's Tale is a very convoluted lighthouse with a model of a lighthouse within a model of a lighthouse within a model of a lighthouse infinitely, where you have to play with scale, and it's a puzzle game where you have to move things around, but it just makes you perceive space quite differently. That's why
So how would that work in physical space?
It's probably longer than I can describe, but YouTube is great.
Okay, thank you.
Is anyone? I'll come around this.
Thank you so much. This is a really interesting panel. I'm just going to stand up so you can see me. I'm slightly biased because I work at university, but I'm interested in, Luke, you used the word game adjacent. I'm interested in, like, would you think of your practice, each of you, as maybe education adjacent? Is there a danger to doing that? Like, when you think of this as educational practice or as some form of pedagogy, there are like literal examples, like maybe corresponding to some of Luke's practice. Like, I have colleagues who teach virtual field work in Fortnite, or, you know, slow geography, counter-tourism. So there are forms of educational practice that are now doing that. I know sound designers who teach sound walks in walking simulators. So that's literal. But then there's obviously these other formats where the education is more about everyday landscapes, you know, the power systems of landscape, climate engagement, and being disruptive about those. So are you uncomfortable with defining yourself maybe as an alternative practitioner of education? Are there dangers to that? I was just curious because you each have slightly different perspectives on it.
Me? No. I don't know, actually, because it's, I mean, what we do ultimately, it's about a new way of what is education and learning about these topics. And when we think about the theory of critical pedagogy, it's all about dismantling what a teacher is. So why is a teacher this usually white man standing in front of the classroom and telling these stories that I don't know who has written, when actually it could be indigenous peoples, it could be scientists working in the field. And then the idea that we need to just accept whatever we are given and not make our choices. And I don't know if it's ever going to kind of like erase education as it is or be an alternative that we start to think more critically. But we are only scared to say that we are an educational game practice when we seek funding or when we need publishers, because they are allergic to the word education. But in our core, yeah, we're not scared to be that.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't think I've been an educator longer than I've been a performer or a maker, and I feel like if you let it and if you frame it in the right way, there's something to be learnt from everything. And it's like a terrible 90s term, which I sort of love, which is edutainment, which I think is just not a bad thing at all. If you can, someone recently described it to me as like, if you can hide your peas in with the mashed potato, like what's wrong with that? Because then people are gonna get their vegetables. But also, yeah, I think. Also, what are we educating people in, and maybe that's the importance of connection and the importance of working together. And I think because I come from the dance world and the performance world, like there's so many what we kind of term slightly insultingly as like soft skills that we have, which are about relating and just relating as human beings. So I feel like if through what I do artistically I can start to question that, and if that means I'm educationally adjacent, then great, I'm totally into that. I'm also a freelancer, so the more hats I can wear, brilliant. Yeah. So, yeah.
I was just going to say, I don't think we can say we're educationally adjacent because we're clearly in a university structure, so we're very much in it. But I think in terms of what we do, like the studio culture is really important. So our school is it has kind of like a background of sort of celebrating speculative architecture rather than necessarily like a very technical education, although you do get that as well. But in the new course that we're running, the cinematic and video game architecture, students are choosing to come and do a one-year course that's precisely at that intersection. So the studio culture and the way that you kind of deliver the teaching is really important to kind of embracing all the different possibilities. And I think one of the key things that we've always found is that the studio culture is a nice way of making it student-led. You know, we've got an incredibly intelligent bunch of students who all bring their own lived experiences. They're from around the world. They all have different cultural backgrounds and different things, different reasons for wanting to be on this course. Like if you're an architect, why do you want to learn these technologies and do this type of work? If you're a game designer, why have you come to work in an architecture school? If you're an animator, And so I think that's really fascinating for us as educators, but definitely the tradition of the studio culture is that we sort of see them like once a week or like once every 2 weeks, and between there they're really kind of self-directed in what they want to pursue, the methods they want to use to do that. And I think that's something about, from my own experience of like architecture education, that's really, really valuable. And so there's that kind of, sometimes the lack of, I wouldn't say lack of structure, but the space between the top-down teaching, if it's ever really that, which it isn't, I think is the space where people kind of grow so much. So that's really always exciting for us.
Yeah, maybe as well it's about, because I do quite a lot of facilitation and artist development work, and we always make sure that we spend a significant amount of time on reflection, because often you're doing, and at the end of a process or even the middle of a process, we're reflecting. And also being a choreographer, and as I'm assuming, much like maybe being a game designer, it can be quite solitary, and you're often beavering away your own thing, and we can be quite protective of what we do and how we do it. So there's something also around finding like-minded people or people who do similar things, and sharing your experiences of like challenges. We're often very good at saying what we're good at and not so good at like sharing what we find challenging. So there's something around that, facilitating that conversation and also that reflection that helps ourselves grow and everyone else grow too. So, but it's not always space that we afford ourselves or make the time for.
Sorry, it's more about architectural stuff. I'm just curious how your background started. Did you go into, you originally started with architectural side of things. I'm just curious how you actually got into the gaming side of things.
So very pragmatically, I studied architecture. I did an undergraduate in architecture. I did a master's in architecture. I then started doing a PhD, which I finished about 7-8 years ago, which was looking at architecture in relation to video games. Okay. So that was the kind of point where I decided I wanted to go into that subject deeper. And as part of that, I had a bit of space within there to like learn how to kind of make things. So the story that I always tell to everyone is I made like kind of Half-Life levels and took them to one of my architecture school interviews, which didn't really go that well. But I don't think they really got it. But there was always that kind of interest because I think from a young age, like playing games transported me to a place that sort of gets you really excited about other places that you've never experienced before. And so it kind of naturally might lead to architecture. But the PhD and then getting the chance with Sandra to teach a studio where we sort of essentially had a blank canvas and we said, we want to get students to make video games about cities, and they said, fine. So that also gives you the chance to like develop a kind of pedagogical structure, which was really helpful for obviously, you know, kind of reinforcing your own way of thinking about things that goes into the research. So I didn't study game design. I kind of like, learned it during the course of doing a PhD.
Very true. My 13-year-old daughter, actually, she's in between. I've not met someone like this, so I'm very intrigued because she's obsessed with the architectural side of things, but she's obsessed with gaming as well. And I often did wonder how the two would go hand in hand. Obviously, with the like building and creating buildings in games and things like that is one thing, but I did wonder whether we should push her into more of the architectural side of things, educational-wise, or the gaming. I mean, I will leave it down to her, but it's just very... you know, I mean, would you eventually, I know you mentioned you and Sandra haven't made your own game yet, is that something that you would eventually like to do, or are you content with teaching?
I wouldn't say never to. It's just carving out the space in time to be able to do that. But I think we would like to try that out at some point in the future. But I think it's the same with academia. With you get locked into projects for like 2 or 3 years, the same as maybe you might spend developing a game. So there's always that kind of, you have to think like a little bit in advance because otherwise you can't slow the oil tanker down.
Very true. Very true. Well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
I think we're probably at a good point to start rounding up. We might have some time for one very quick question if there's one left.
So I think the one thing that I observe is a common thread between all three of your practices is this idea of participation, but not just getting other people into your space, but sort of being able to sort of like fragment yourself and put yourself in the not just the shoes, but the body of another person, you know, and I'm just wondering, right, that's a very difficult thing to manage. It's a very difficult thing to cultivate as a practice for yourself, not just as a game designer, but as a person. If you not sure if you have anything to say about this. If you don't, it's fine, but like, I'm just curious about how have you integrated this kind of practice into your day-to-day life and vice versa, if that's something you think is relevant?
There are like 3 pillars that I discovered, that I sort of defined quite early on, and I'm going to make them sort of dance specific-ish. So the 3 are: everyone is creative, everybody can dance, and dance can happen anywhere. And that goes across everything that I make in some way. We don't always hit all 3, but just thinking in the context of today, if it were everyone is playful, everybody can play can happen anywhere, like maybe that's something that feels more universal, and I wonder if that, I don't know, is a helpful thought?
For us, and I guess for me, it was always about having curiosity to listen to somebody else's story, and my, I guess, personal philosophy that you can learn something from everybody, and everybody has something to share. And as a designer, I feel like we have, when we are designers or architects or practitioners or dancers, performers, we are privileged to have a skill, and if we can use that to help to build platforms for stories that are unheard and that are silenced to come to life, then that would be great for us.
Yeah, I think maybe aside from like the positioning of ourselves in relation to it, it's what you discover from putting the work out there as well. I think that when we were lucky to do the piece for Now Play This, we'd kind of developed all these kind of cards that people would follow between the idea of it, because we make a lot of games that are about like being a designer, which is sort of natural maybe, but we made all these cards, and they were sort of, you could play it in quite structure and sort of learn all these rules about the history of London, but then children came and played the game in a completely different way, far more creative than would have been if we had, if they'd kind of slavishly followed the rules. And I think that's really exciting because everyone brings a little piece of them into the kind of the co-design of the thing that you made, and that's obviously like really wonderful to witness and often completely unexpected. And I think that's been like a really powerful thing that we found through doing this type of project.
I'd like to, if it's all right, kind of give an answer to this as well. I feel because I'd like to kind of frame this for all of you. I know we come from slightly different backgrounds in terms of how we've kind of come into games, so this might not be kind of universally accepted, but I feel like I personally make art as a way of questioning what's around me, like as a way of kind of exploring and investigating. Like it's just the way that I seem to want to try and understand things. And so maybe there's something in not trying to integrate the work we're doing into your day-to-day life, but see how you're already doing it. Like the fact that we're all here in this room today, it's a beautiful week, sun. We've got the weekdays off, which is glorious, and yet we're kind of spending this time doing this together. I think that is an illustration of the integration of trying to explore these things and kind of use them for our lives more generally. I don't want to be the last person who speaks, though, also. So I would invite you all, as a lightning round, as it were, we're in a game show, to just give one piece of advice. All our participants here will be doing some making over the next kind of rest of today and tomorrow. A little piece of advice. What you got? Doesn't have to be about making games.
Oh my God. We actually had one more question.
Fantastic. Where? Do we?
There, yes. If you'd like to ask that question.
Yeah.
Just to be safe from the... So we have time to think. Yes, quick.
I'm sorry, but this is quite a specific question for Luke, if I may. You said that in your teaching practice at university, you do a lot of speculative architecture, and you're inspired by, you said, I think the 60s and 70s. I find that I used to be, so in my creative practice, I look a lot at futurism and retrofuturism, and I used to be really inspired by the pure optimism and empowerment of like sci-fi from the 50s and the 60s. But I find that there's also like a streak of sort of like ultra-capitalism in it. I was wondering what your opinion is on being inspired by these very dominating and ultra-capitalist kind of empowerment from the 50s and 60s sci-fi, and whether it's problematic in your practice, and how, do you have any advice as to how to incorporate that inspiration, but to also like ameliorate the effects of like the, yeah. I hope I'm making myself clear.
Yeah, I think it comes down to this idea of the sort of the layers. So some of the 60s and 70s architecture, and it shouldn't just, not just 60s and 70s, you can go back through history. But in the 60s and 70s, like some of the Italian groups that are very well, very famous, like Super Studio or Archizoom is one of my personal favorites. They took like the language of modernist architecture because they wanted to make a critique about capitalism, but they took that language and they used it to make the critique. So it's, it's kind of like a speculation using the raw materials of the thing they're arguing against to then make that critique. And I think that kind of comes into the things that we're doing about like the city build. If you make something that looks like a city builder, you expect it to do a certain thing, but if you then take it off in another direction by disrupting what that expectation is, you can start to make kind of quite powerful messages. So maybe that would be my final thing is like if you kind of disrupt people's expectations of things, especially in the world of games, I suppose, where maybe if you go into the commercial world, you have these kind of conventions of genre, you have these conventions of settings, and I can't really talk about it, but Sandra's doing some really interesting research about, she's from Iraq, and so where she's from has been represented very negatively as basically a war zone in so many games. So she's doing some really beautiful research about how to like recapture that. So again, it's not really my place to talk about the work because it's not my experience, but I think there's that kind of real power in kind of recalibrating what our expectations of things are or subverting them. And I think that's something that is generally always going to be really productive.
From me, I think, and you're going to come to the workshop later, I think my advice would be to always tell your stories, to always tell your truths, and to use all the medium that you choose, be it games or anything else, to say something that is meaningful to you and that you think the world needs to hear. And you're going to find out how in the workshop later.
I think something, this idea of disruption has come across a little bit. So from everyone, I think. So are you disrupting the context or the content or the container of it? And bigger question, different question, where is the joy? Can you find the joy in everything that we do somehow? Even if it's serious or issue-based, or like there's a preconception that it might be a little like sober. You said I enjoyed that word. So yeah, where's the joy?
I think that's a perfect place to wrap up for this panel. Thank you all, and please give a huge round of applause to our wonderful panelists, Tim Casson, Sindi Breshani and Luke Pearson.